afternoon to anyone who's watching online. Hello everyone in the room, and welcome to the final CODEC research seminar of the what year are we? 2014-15 academic year, and we're going to have Josh Mann, who is currently completing a PhD in Luke and Acts and is a research fellow in biblical literacy for CODEC. So, Josh.
Thank you very much, Bex. All right. So I want to talk a little bit about scrolls and scrolling and kind of take a look through history at versions of the Bible and to think about the things that have stayed the same, the things that change, and some of the ways in which meaning is conveyed, possibly in ways that we don't realize. And so let me dive right in. Not long ago, while reading Luke's version of the triumphal entry, a new meaning of a familiar text occurred to me. It was all because I had to flip the page to continue reading. It's a page flip, all of you live YouTubers. The reader of the triumphal entry in the Gospel of Luke follows the disciples into a village where they find a colt, just as Jesus had said they would. A few lines later, one follows Jesus, who is descending down the slope near the Mount of Olives, riding on that colt, preparing to enter Jerusalem. And it's really quite a dramatic scene in the narrative because the Gospel has anticipated Jesus' arrival to the holy city for nearly half of its runtime heretofore. So since Luke 9:51, so the triumphal entry is in Luke 19. So if you're watching a 2-hour film, you're an hour and a half into the movie, and for 45 minutes, you've been anticipating something to happen. That's kind of where we're at in Luke's narrative. So finally, Jesus is sort of coming to Jerusalem. So there's drama. Jesus is lauded by a crowd of disciples whose praise includes, it seems, the application of Psalm 118:26 to the miracle-working writer. The Pharisees, seemingly ever present at times like these, call on Jesus to rebuke his disciples. Jesus returns their serve forcefully, saying, "If they keep silent, the stones will cry out." Now, at this point, in verse 41, the Nestle Aland text, which was the one I was reading, has its first new paragraph since verse 29, and it's marked by a new indented line. And you can see in the kind of the last line of the main text there in Greek. So the new paragraph begins, and here's a translation that roughly captures the word order. "And as he came near, when he saw the city, he wept over it." It's a complete sentence in Greek, even though there's no punctuation at the end of it. And it's the end of the line, and it's the end of the page of main text. So the sentence goes on, and the next verse, verse 42, carries on that sentence with a dependent clause. And it's a bit of commentary from Jesus regarding the state of the city. But to move from that last word in verse 41 to the next word in verse 42, I had to flip the page. So coming to the end of the page created an extra moment for my mind to process what I just read. The contrast between the praise of the disciples as Jesus approaches Jerusalem and the weeping of Jesus at the sight of Jerusalem was particularly striking, especially given the extra moment of reflection. In this sense, the text meant something different to me. It is in this sense that I am saying that the text had a new meaning. So there were a few other factors that contributed to this effect besides just the page layout. The indentation that we mentioned, verse 41, sort of set apart. So it's set off slightly with what precedes. The verse is a complete sentence, so the reader isn't necessarily looking for the rest of the sentence. And the word order in verse 41, which my translation roughly preserved, saves the weeping for the final third of the sentence, and so it becomes the note, as it were, that ends the page. So one of the key features of the text that gave rise to this meaning is the layout, the page layout. This is a property of the codex book form, and we might classify it as a paratextual property. Gerard Genet gave the name paratext to those threshold features of a text, what he variously described as what enables a text to become a book and to be offered as such to its readers. Or elsewhere he says, an undefined zone without any hard and fast boundary on either the inward side, turned toward the text, or the outward side, turned toward the world's discourse about the text. Or following Philippe Lejeune, a fringe of the printed text which in reality controls one's whole reading of the text. The paratext is a zone of transaction, a privileged place of pragmatics and a strategy, of an influence on the public. So, to take a paratext from Genet's own book, we can see this slide. Paratexts are those liminal devices and conventions both within and outside the book that form part of the complex mediation between book, author, publisher, and reader. Examples being titles, forewords, epigraphs, and publisher's jacket copy. Genet thought of paratext as authorial or legitimated by the author. So the author is involved or agrees in some sense. He says, by definition, something is not a paratext unless the author or one of his associates accepts responsibility for it. I'm not going to be so strict when I talk about paratexts, especially when I'm thinking about digital paratexts. And in fact, other authors have similarly sort of loosened the definition a bit when we think about digital media. For our purposes, paratexts may be produced by an author or publisher, which in software or digital editions could even include people like developers, which is really interesting, I think, editors and so on. But I think they also include, or I'll include in my definition of paratext, visual features associated with typography, page layout, and book design, things like this. So the key is that these paratexts have illocutionary force. In other words, paratexts mean something to us. It literally mean something. They affect our expectations of encountering the text and indeed the encounter itself. What I would like to do then is examine briefly some paratextual features of Bibles, ancient and recent, and in light of this suggest some things that you might consider as you read texts of various kinds. And it, I think, sort of puts into perspective particularly Bible reading, which is sort of the focus of today's talk, and how does the reading experience change with digital Bibles. So, let's talk about Josh's Bible. So my Bible I've brought, this is the Bible I usually use. It's not exactly the one that you see on the slide. Leather bound, black leather cover, which is part of its paratext. Leather indicates value. There's an expectation of endurance, that this will be used. It's important. It's not a paperback. Often Bibles, it's probably a common binding, even though it's one of the more expensive bindings that can be chosen. You see it's codex book form, which is no surprise these days to us, but leaves bound on one side. Pages can flip like we would expect modern books to do. But notice that it gives a strong indication of canonicity, that this is a collection of ancient documents that somehow, for some reason, belong together. Notably, this Bible doesn't include certain texts that are sometimes classified, and not unproblematically, as apocryphal. In fact, I brought for you the Oxford Annotated Apocrypha, which is such a Protestant thing for me to have the Apocrypha bound separate from my Bible, right? So there's even something being communicated by having an Apocrypha bound hardback separate from this Bible. So even the cover, the binding, reflects, it indicates something. It's a paratextual message, if you will, about canon, and that something binds these texts together, even quite literally. The first pages in my Bible, really interesting. I'd never really looked and thought about it this hard, but it says presented to, by, on. Mine's not filled out, so I think I got it for Christmas, but apparently whoever gave it to me didn't want to note that. Then the next page, this certifies that blank and blank were united in holy matrimony on such and such day. Then I've got a list for births, a whole page for marriages, and a whole page for deaths, a page that reads family record, and then church record. These are the first pages in my Bible, and these indicate that, according to the publisher, apparently, this book has something to do with these very important events in a person's life. And even the presentation of the book to me ought to be recorded sort of in the first page, big print, this sort of thing. It's actually kind of a strong paratextual message when you think about it. The title page of my Bible says, The Holy Bible. I looked on my shelf, I've got the Jerusalem Bible, and it simply says the Jerusalem Bible. But calling the Bible the Holy Bible on the title page does indicate a certain viewpoint and a certain, really it sets up an expectation for what one will encounter in the text, I think. Then in the foreword I found this: the New American Standard Bible has been produced with the conviction that the words of Scripture as originally penned in the Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek were inspired by God. Wow, I've never read that. So even in the foreword, the publishers are very explicit that they have a certain ideology that's presumably driven the translation, and perhaps even the layout of the text. And you'll notice if you open up any Bible, usually there are decisions made about whether to have a single column or a double column layout of the main text. Sometimes there's notes, and those might even be in a third column. Mine is double column with chapter and verse numbers. Paragraphs are set out by a bold verse number with actually the paragraph symbol. So these are some of the ways that the translators and publishers are trying to communicate meaning sort of beyond even the actual text of the Bible. In my Bible, Jesus' words are printed in red, including in the book of Revelation, which is always interesting. There's a bit in the book of Acts where Jesus is quoted. And so red letters aren't only found in the Gospels. At the back of my Bible, there's a section, which actually I've lost, I guess. According to the table of contents, I should have found a section called Promises from the Bible, which also communicates something to a reader, that something about this book is important, that you can sort of extract promises that you can count on. And then, of course, at the back, the best Bibles have maps, right? Even my annotated Apocrypha has maps in the front and the back. So these are all paratextual features that most of us who are familiar with the Bible would be familiar with. But these things all subtly communicate a message about the text. I've also brought the Biblica Institute has published a Community Bible Experience series of Bibles. This is the books Genesis through Kings, and it's printed sort of on Bible-y paper, so it shares some of the paratextual features that my Bible has. But it's single column, and it's printed in an effort to make it a bit closer to a modern novel feel. And some of the opening pages talk about how it says the drama of the Bible in 6 acts. So it's immediately setting the reader up to expect that the Bible is actually this story and that it all fits together. So I thought that was another interesting example. But let's go back in time. Codex Sinaiticus, it's a very important ancient manuscript, one of the earliest sort of complete manuscripts of the Bible we have. It's in the Codex book form, so it's bound on one side, opens like a book that we would expect. It includes what we could call the apocryphal texts. So again, it has a suggestion about canonicity, what belongs in the Bible. You'll notice on this one, so if you were to access this online, you'd probably go through the British Library page. And notice the left side of each image, you've got this nice instrument that measures the page. You've got a color spectrum and a shading spectrum to give you some sort of objective way to think about the color of the manuscript. And it's hard to see my background if that title kind of covers up, but you might see British Library, a little tag on the ruler, which is a paratext that it locates Codex Sinaiticus to a cultural, intellectual institution, which suggests that this book is apparently very important. Also, notice the page layout is 4 columns in standard uncial script, so they're capital letters written in scriptio continua, as was common in the time. You can notice how the paragraphs are laid out a bit, so there's hanging indents used at where the paragraphs begin. And let's zoom in and look at our passage. Verse 41 begins right here, Kai hos Angusin, and it ends right here with Altain, it. So he wept over it, and then this is verse 42. So you can see it's completely different than Nestle Elon text. There's no possible page break or indication that we ought to pause. It just goes right on. Food for thought. What happens if we remove everything but the text? So here is a slide that depicts the same image, except I've stripped everything out using a program called ScanTailor. In what ways might meaning be shifted without some of those paratextual features that we've discussed? So here's another fun example. The Lindisfarne Gospels. Beautiful, a beautiful text. What meaning does the calligraphy convey? The insular script. Here is the incipit page for the Gospel of Luke. It contains the opening text of the Gospel in Latin, which suggests the importance of the text itself. So some of the beautiful imagery is actually making prominent the text itself, which I think does give an indication of how the reader ought to approach it, an attempt by the author to convey certain meaning. It originally had a leather cover, so I've read, not seen it actually, and I've read a jeweled cover was added in the 8th century. Again, so those are examples of the way that the paratext actually changed over time. About a century or within a century after its making, there was a note added to the end saying that the author was a monk called Eadfrith, Bishop of Lindisfarne. And so there's another paratextual note that apparently was added at some point. But notice without that, I mean, with or without that note, if it was originally anonymous, that suggests something. Today, authors tend to put their names on things like this. And an author's name is a paratextual feature. The British Library has a note that I thought was interesting. They're picking up on some of the paratext. They say religious differences between the indigenous Celtic Church and the New Roman Church were settled at the Synod of Whitby in 664. In the manuscript, native Celtic and Anglo-Saxon elements blend with Roman, Coptic, and Eastern traditions to create a sublimely unified artistic vision of the cultural melting pot of Northumbria in the 7th and 8th centuries. That's really interesting, and really something I think that the paratext is arguably communicating. So a page from the Gospel of Luke, double column text. Notice the indentation and paragraph markers, the choices that they've made, or Eadfrith has made. And then a later translator sort of added little bits. So when we're thinking about paratext, we might think about analogous features of digital text. Here, for fun, is a snapshot of The Perfect Word, which was a Bible program you could have purchased in 1989. I believe the developer was the man who went on to develop Accordance Bible software, but he sold this. But there you go, 1989 on the Mac. It's really pretty impressive. You can see that search is pulling up results, and he sort of got 3 panes and the search box. That was a little while back, but some things haven't changed much. So I did a Google search for triumphal entry in Luke, and the first result brought me to Bible Gateway. So I thought this might be an interesting example. It's the King James Version. Every verse gets a new line. It's single column. And yet there's indication that there are notes, that you can get at notes. You can search for things. You can print this. You can alter its paratext. You can alter its formatting. You can listen to it. This little audio icon. We also learn that the Reformation Study Bible notes are now available on Bible Gateway. So these are all things that have been added. There are hypertexts, hyperlinks that take us elsewhere. There's an app and a store on the navigation bar, which all make suggestions about this text that we're reading. Here's another example from Tyndale House, Cambridge has produced a web app called it's at stepbible.org, and I'm just going to talk you through a video here of me sort of playing with it. So I've just gone to Luke 19, and I'm scrolling down to the triumphal entry passage. So you see, this looks a lot like a study Bible. It's single column, but it has sort of a small column with notes. There's also a lot of hypertextual things going on. When you hover on a word, you get more information. Resizing the window, the text wraps to the window. Of course, it'd be very difficult to have that with a print book. And you can see here, I can toggle off headings, verse numbers, notes, and references. And so, kind of in real time, I'm changing the paratext. I'm changing all of these things. I personally don't like complete text wrap because you end up with these really texty windows, if I can use that adjective. So let's try to reduplicate a mobile. Here is essentially the same web app on a mobile device. You know, if you think about your own mobile device or iPad or whatever, think about sort of how touch devices have certain haptic features that are quite different than their print counterparts. You touch the glass. Usually, as you move your finger, the text moves with it, right? Whereas, if you're reading a traditional book, you can move your finger over the text. You don't hold the Bible in quite the same way either, do you? Think also about the way that canonicity, remember how the leather binding sort of gives a faint indication of canonicity in that these texts belong together. Think about in this example, or with the Bible Gateway example, in what sense are the different books of the Bible, quote unquote, held together or bound together? Where's that sense of binding? I think that's an interesting question, perhaps, that communities of faith and theologians should be asking. So we get a different sense. Speaking of haptic features, I thought it might be interesting to think about a Braille Bible. And so I've got the Gospel of Luke in Braille, actually, and I'm going to pass it around because if you're like me, this is absolutely fascinating to sort of try to reduplicate a Braille reading experience. And I suspect that the paratextual features of a Braille text are very different for a visually impaired person than they would be for us if we close our eyes, even if presumably, arguably, or hypothetically, we could read Braille. So, I'm not even really sure how to reflect exactly on what paratexts might jump out at somebody who uses Braille because they're visually impaired. But suffice it to say that Braille has certain paratextual features, and there's a certain kind of haptic feature to the text. There's a certain speed at which you can read comfortably. There are margins, there's space, there's sort of page layout. And if you look at this Braille Bible from 1882, you can see that this actually looks a bit more like a Bible that we might find. Most Bibles are published this way, leather bound. Presumably the feel of that to a visually impaired person indicates something about the text. This is a spiral bound. The example I'm passing around is spiral bound. It's clearly less expensive to produce than this leather bound version. And in fact, there's a number of ministries who are doing this sort of spiral bound thing for free. They ask you to donate and things like that. So there's a kind of a different sense that you get even from the Braille Bible. And so for fun, here are a few other examples. So the American Bible Society, in 2013, to celebrate their birthday, produced a gallery of images, and each image is a juxtaposition of sort of an old American Bible Society image and a new one. And I think this is actually interesting food for thought when we're thinking about paratexts. So in 1835, apparently they were involved with the Braille Bible. And here we are in 2013, they say Bible search. But it's interesting to think about how the paratexts are different. Here's one I really like. In 1860, the Pony Express. Just curious, have you heard of the Pony Express? Well, I'm going to tell you about it because it originated in the town from which I came, essentially. So I grew up 15 miles from St. Joseph, Missouri. And in 1860, there began a mail delivery service called the Pony Express, in which you could mail something, and it would take 10 days to get from St. Joseph, Missouri, which is right in the middle of the U.S., to Sacramento, California, by horseback. So they had relay stations of horses and riders who would ride the mail out. The American Bible Society gave Bibles to this Pony Express, and actually one of the owners made every rider carry one, and actually made them take a Christian oath, which is beside the point, but is interesting nonetheless. So there's your bit of trivia. But notice, leather-bound, sort of a hard leather-bound book. It would need to be durable to be carried by the riders. 2013, you see an example of an iPad, and their tagline is Express Downloads. But notice very different paratexts there that we could think about. 1957, finger-operated phonograph. So this is sort of like a turntable or record player that's manually operated. So you get kind of scratchy audio, Bible reading. The Watchtower organization, in I think the 1930s or perhaps a bit earlier, used to make these little suitcase phonographs, and they would distribute them with some of their literature. So actually, there were a number of sort of Bible Society-like organizations trying to make use of this. What sort of paratexts might be conveyed with a finger-operated phonograph, or today with different audio versions of the Bible? And then you see juxtaposed with that an iPhone and a Bible app. 1861, American Bible Society distributed Bibles to Civil War soldiers. They were based in New York City, but managed to distribute to both the Union Army and the Confederate Army, and sort of tried to take a neutral position. But both sides of the war had sort of, religion and war have often been sort of mixed, and actually both sides were making sort of religious claims based on the Bible. So it's interesting to think about the paratexts of a Bible in a military context. 2013, Operation Enduring Freedom. This is really interesting. Have you ever seen a Bible with a cover with camouflage on it, intended to be given to a military person? I've actually seen a lot of these. And it's an example that still today, in a lot of Western countries, there is sort of this mingling of Christianity, the Bible, and war, interestingly. So that's a camouflage pattern you'll find. And ironically, it's pixelated, which is a pattern used by Canadian and American forces. So those are some interesting sort of pictures to think about the juxtaposition of older or newer Bible versions and how the paratexts communicate different things. So what? It is important that readers of biblical texts, scholars especially, I would argue, are aware of the ways that paratexts are framing those texts and contributing to meaning. This is all the more important as readers are increasingly interacting with the texts in new digital media forms where paratextuality is largely unexplored. Communities of faith are also asking questions about digital versions of their sacred texts. So we've seen that the Bible has been present in new media for a long time. The CODEC book form would be a great example in early Christianity. And this, I think, would continue to be the case for the foreseeable future. One way we can think critically about how new media forms of biblical texts affect and effect the reading experiences is to consider and compare their paratexts. Indeed, they need to be evaluated according to one's priorities or an organization's priorities, ideology, beliefs, and so on. I suspect various communities of faith would come to different conclusions about what sort of Bibles they ought to publish, depending on their theologies. And so would individuals come to different conclusions who are reading the Bible for various reasons. So are you in the market for a new Bible? Think about its paratext. What's important to you or to that person to whom you might want to give a Bible? Or if you're a children's worker or parent, what sort of paratextual messages is your children's Bible sending? My son was actually, this sounds super pious, it's not. My son was reading his Bible this morning. He's 3. He was flipping through, and this wasn't planned as part of the talk, he was flipping through this little children's Bible, picture by picture. He can't read. But we have read some of those stories, and so when he sees a picture of a familiar story, what sorts of things are communicated by those pictures? Interesting question. You in the market for a pew Bible? Churches often are. What sorts of paratextual things might they consider? Or is your church or organization or denomination considering how to handle or whether or not to offer advice on digital versions of the Bible? Or to actually evaluate, are certain versions better than others? These are questions that, to answer these questions you have to consider the paratext. Publishers obviously have considered some of these things. So I know that Biblica had to consider what kind of paper do you use if you're trying to print a Bible sort of like a modern novel. Well, they ended up going with Bible-y paper. You can imagine that some people find Bible-y paper comforting because that's what they're used to. Others find it annoying. Just a decision that has to be made. But I think publishers also need to be thinking about when they're licensing their texts, and this includes Bibles, but this also includes books. So often now publishers are licensing their books for different digital platforms. I wonder, though, how deeply they're thinking about the kinds of paratexts that will be added to those licensed texts when they go out. So it's something I'm doing throughout this year. I'm thinking about this in terms of Bible software that scholars often use, and the way that different versions are, sort of the meaning is a bit different because of the paratexts. And finally, I think publishers should think about, a little bit like a translator, and think about the contextualizing of what they're publishing. So if a publisher is publishing a Bible for a specific context or culture, they need to be thinking about the paratexts that culture is familiar with and what sorts of things that communicates. Not just about the way that they interpret their own paratexts that they're familiar with. So I think paratextuality is important. I think in terms of digital versions of Bibles, it's just beginning to really be explored. There's been a little bit of work done on it, but not a lot. And I do think there's very practical reasons for thinking about it, but also some very important academic questions to be asked of it. Thank you very much.